All right. So hopefully here beginning week 3, you're starting to hit your stride with this online learning, and hopefully it won't go on too much longer. We'll have to see what tomorrow brings, but we have major topics here for today: the phylum Mollusca and phylum Echinodermata. And if you wanted to look in your book, chapters 23.4 and 23.6 is where you would find the material that we're looking at today. All right. We have a few required videos for you. And so part of your homework, remember, is to watch these videos, and you'll include some information from these videos in your student notes that you'll be turning in this Friday. Okay? All right. So let's get right into the content then. Here we are with the phylum Mollusca. It includes such things as clams, snails, octopuses. The Latin means thin-shelled, or from a term that means soft. So mollusca is soft or soft-shelled. Some of the characteristics for all these members, looking at our examples here, it's quite a diverse set of animals. But what do we see with all of them? We see an open circulatory system. So as the blood is pumped through blood vessels, then it enters the tissue of the animal and then flows through that tissue until it's finally collected again to return to the heart or pass through the part of the animal that will oxygenate that fluid, that blood or blood-like fluid. They have a complete digestive system, so that means that they have a mouth and an anus, so the food can go through in one direction without having to go back and forth, which is the efficient way of doing things. And they tend to have bilateral symmetry, so one plane that you can cut them along where the two sides are symmetrical. Mollusks will share some features. Not every individual will have all of these features, but they will have at least one of them. So one of those features is a radula, which is a feeding organ. It's kind of like a file where they scrape away at organic matter that they can eat, and they scrape it, and then they can ingest what they've scraped away. So a snail will have a radula like that, where we see them go along scraping at things and eating what they scrape off. They have a mantle, a tissue that covers the internal organs. In many of them, the mantle will secrete a hard calcium-based shell, and they will have a muscular foot, and that foot will provide movement, and depending on the creature, it might have other functions as well. We'll look at 3 common classes of mollusk. There are 8 or 9 recognized classes of mollusk, but three common ones will include most of the creatures that we think of when we think of mollusks. So we have the gastropods. Gastro is stomach, and pod foot. So the stomach foots includes the snails. So they have a foot that goes along the ground that allows them to move. And then we have the bivalves: clams, oysters, mussels, scallops. They have 2 shells. So bivalve, so they have two shells that are hinged to open up, and so those will be our examples of that one. Cephalopods include squids, octopuses, nautiluses, things like that. All right, moving on to phylum Echinodermata. They include things like the sea stars, the sea urchins. Uh, we have the term echidno, which would be porcupine or hedgehog, and dermata, which means skin. So we have porcupine skin for the name of it, and if you look at uh, many of these, like sea urchins, they are covered with little spines, often poisonous spines that have uh, an appearance something like a porcupine. Members of Echinodermata, they have an open circulatory system, so they pump blood or blood like fluid through their body, and that is not contained in blood vessels through the whole journey through its body. So sometimes it's just flowing through the tissues, and then it gets collected and then will be oxygenated by gills or another organ to oxygenize that blood, and then gets pumped back out into the body once it has oxygen again. Um, they will have radial symmetry, and usually that is going to be 5-pointed radial symmetry. That's easy to see in the sea star, but if you look closely at almost all of these animals, you can find a 5-pointed pattern in their bodies. But they're classified with the bilateral animals because they have a bilateral body plan in their larval stage. Another interesting thing about these is many of them can regenerate limbs. So if a sea star loses one of its legs, then it will grow a new one back. If there's enough of its body, like if it gets cut in half, both halves could regenerate. So that is one possible form of asexual reproduction there for those sea stars. An interesting thing about them is they have a water vascular system. So they have these water filled canals that can store water and that can be pumped through the body and provide the oxygen to that organism. Another feature, like when you think of a sea star, you might think of it as just something that sits in one place, but they can actually walk. They have tiny little tube feet, and they can move those tube feet by pushing water into those uh, into those little tubes, then move around the bottom of the ocean. We have 5 classes of echinoderms. One of them, crinoids. I know Mr. Paul will say crinoids. They're both accepted. Again, in geology, I hear crinoid more than crinoid, but maybe that's different for biology. I see lots and lots of crinoid fossils. I didn't include pictures here, but there's a very nice picture here, better than any of my examples, where the whole crinoid is visible, all still attached together. That's not the way that you usually find crinoids. Usually, fossil crinoids have been ripped apart into little pieces, and so you might find a few of the rings that make up the stalk together in one piece, or you might find like the feathery little protrusions on the top together, but it's not very often that you find a whole crinoid all together like in the example fossil in the slide. Another one, Astroidea. So Astroidea, aster, in flowers. There are asters, and you might know astronomy. So aster means star, right? These are the sea stars. And in many environments, we find that the sea stars are a very important part of the ecosystem. They will eat mussels. They get a mussel and then they will take their stomach and actually uh, push their stomach out and make it go into the mussel and then start digesting that mussel on the outside of its body. Once it's digested it partially, then it will suck its stomach back in and complete digestion there inside. A different sort of arrangement for those guys. Another class are the brittle stars and basket stars here. So they look something like the sea stars, but they are more complex. We have our sea urchins, sea biscuits, and sand dollars together. An interesting feature of sea urchins is some of them, like the red sea urchin, can live to be 200 years old. So, very long lived. One other note is that they are sometimes caught to be eaten. Uni in Japanese food, the uni would be the reproductive organs of those sea urchins. And then we have our sea cucumbers. Again, there's a lot of diversity to how these sea cucumbers look, but they are quite a different type of look to our other echinoderms. All right. So if we look at what we've seen so far, we've looked at all of our invertebrates except for one phylum yet to go, the arthropods. But that last phylum makes up the vast majority of species and the vast majority of individual organisms. So, and since invertebrates make up the vast majority of all animals, arthropods are a huge portion of the animals that we find on Earth. So, next time we will have a look at arthropods and then we'll move on from there.